Good morning, Bible scholars all over the Comet Nation. Happy to be here. We're going to be talking today a little bit about Paul's conversion. It's going to be a follow-up from Mr. Van Heidsma's discussion a few weeks ago. In your device, if you have one near you, you're going to want to open up Acts chapter 22, but we're also going to reference Acts chapter 14 because there's a little bit of a connection to Paul's conversion. Now, I'm going to be reading to you some transcript from a gentleman that I follow a lot. His name is Dr. Michael Heiser. I've learned so much from this guy, but we're going to learn how Paul's conversion connects through different chapters and just some stuff, some inside stuff that maybe we don't see. But let's start out by reading Acts chapter 22, starting with verse 1. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in the city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way, capital way, before that was what was called before Christianity, to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear with me. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who were there and bring them into bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you'll be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one, Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to every one of what you have seen and heard. And now you will do what you wait. Now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into the trance and saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now, if you're able to, and you want to open up Acts 14, we're just going to reference it. We're not going to read the whole chapter. We're just going to reference it. So we're going to start, it says in Acts 22, Brothers and fathers, hear the defense I now make before you. And when they had heard, back in chapter 14, and when they had heard that he was addressing them in Hebrew language, they even became more quiet, and so on. And we read that. From this point on, Paul is going to get into his testimony, which we've covered in previous episodes, about how he went to Damascus. He gets knocked off the horse, and light shines down on him, and he hears the voice of Jesus. I am Jesus of Nazareth, who you're persecuting, and so forth. We know Paul's conversion story, and after Paul's conversion, it becomes a little murkier. The part of his life that we're familiar with is just what he's going to get into. Really, from this verse, we stopped at right around verse 6 all the way to verse 16, we get the familiar story of Paul, his testimony, what happens to him on the way to Damascus, how Ananias befriends him, and how he was baptized and the scales fell from his eyes, and so on and so forth. We all know that. That's the part about Paul's life we know. What we really don't know is, well, what happened to him afterwards, sort of what he did prior to when he shows up in the books of Acts, not just 14, but 13, and when the Jerusalem council reported about his ministry, and so on and so forth. In Acts 13, that really marks when Paul begins to engage in some sort of endorsed ministry, or the ministry that God really picked out for him. So that there is the nebulous period. So what's going to become an issue when we return to Acts 22? Now let's go back to Acts chapter 14. Paul and his companions through their missionary journeys, and then Acts 14, we hit a specific episode. Let me read Acts 14, 19 through 23. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and then the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples. So we ask the question, when we're at this point early. In this event, when he was stoned at Lystra, what Paul is referring to or referred to later when he wrote in his second letter to 2 Corinthians in chapter 12, where Paul describes sort of a mythical spiritual experience. So we ask the question, did Paul have a near-death experience at Lystra? And there have been others that have asked that same question. Our answers was no because, really of chronology. Let me read 2 Corinthians 12, though you sort of know what I'm talking about. So we have Paul here in Lystra. He gets done. Did he have a near-death experience? Is this what he's referring to when he writes this chapter or these verses as follows? Here's 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, only God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast because of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than sees me or hears from me. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of my surpassing greatness of revelations. So that statement right there connects what he has just been describing, this sort of anonymous person, this man in Christ who saw visions and revelations of the Lord. Here he says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, he connects himself to that person. He is this person. A thorn was given me in flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, I am strong. Now, that's the first 10 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Scholars have wondered, what was he talking about? This vision, the revelations of the Lord. And some ask, well, maybe what happened at Lystra, maybe there's a connection here. The problem with it is, the chronological reference points of 14 years ago. If you go through the chronology of the life of the Apostle Paul, the Lystra event is really hard to align with Paul's comment in 2 Corinthians 12:2 about something that happened to him 14 years ago. And so for that reason, and for some other things, we'll get into this a little bit, it seems best to identify what Paul writes about 2 Corinthians 12 with some other event in his life. And that event is something he refers to in Acts 22. So let's go back to Acts 22. Paul is giving his testimony in verses 6 to 16. And so let's jump back to verse 17. So let's listen to what Paul says here. He just given his testimony. He's been baptized. Now verse 17 of Acts 22 says this. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that I am one in the synagogue after I was in prison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he shall not be allowed to live. When the Roman tribune takes him into the barracks, and then the rest of the story ensues. What I want to focus on is this little anecdote by Paul. We know the story of his conversion. He goes to Damascus, Ananias befriends him, and he gets baptized. The scales fall from his eyes, and eventually they will have to help him escape from Damascus. So right around when that's happening, uh, when when I return to Jerusalem, and he falls into a trance, and the voice says, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly." I don't know if there's a real chronological problem with that. I guess I could live with the rendering, but some might think there's a little confusion here. Just look at what it says. He goes back to Jerusalem, was praying, falls into a trance, and a voice says, "Well, yeah, you're back in Jerusalem, so now get out of here. Get out of Jerusalem quickly because they won't accept your testimony about me." You could fiddle with the language here a little bit, but make maybe the transition a little bit clearer, but I guess it's adequate. The point is, Paul leaves Damascus, goes back to Jerusalem, and at some point, we're not really told how long he's there. Even in other places, he alludes to what he's doing. At some point, Jesus appears to him. He's in a trance. It says, "I fell into a trance, and he saw him saying to me." Well, the him in context there is the Lord, and he addresses him as Lord, and around verse 21, he said to me, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." We know it's the Lord, so at some point, when he's there in Jerusalem, the Lord comes to him and says, "Get out of here. I know you have to leave Damascus. You came here." Well, that's logical, but you got to get out of here too, because it's just not the time for you to be here. They're not going to accept what you say, so you need to go somewhere else, and he does. Again, Paul alludes to some other things he did before Acts 13 when he winds up back in 13 and 15. He winds up back in Jerusalem, telling the disciples, the church in Jerusalem, what's going on, and they do accept him. So there's this interval there, but it's initiated by his trance, which is kind of odd. It's very easy to miss this line about him praying in the temple, and then he falls into a trance. A lot of scholars think that this is the event that Paul was referring to in the 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that I read earlier. In other words, when he falls into this trance early in his life as a believer, shortly after his conversion, when this happens to him, this is what he sees, what he describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And we don't get a lot of details. He says he was caught up, this man, this third person, I knew this man, was caught up in paradise, whether it's in the body or out of the body, I do not know, only God knows. So we get a little detail. He hears the things that really he shouldn't have heard, and he shouldn't talk about, and he doesn't want to talk about. And after that, the messenger, quote unquote, of Satan harasses him, the thorn and the threat in his flesh, and he asks God to deal with that and to take it away. God says, "My grace is sufficient," and so forth. So we get these little snippets that have something to do with his experience that he alludes to in Acts 22, or at least Luke does, and that Paul, if there's a connection, alludes to in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. So I'm going to go on with the presumption that there is a connection between this trance in events, Acts chapter 22, and what Paul was writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, or verse 12, or chapter 12, sorry. What I want to do is lay out what scholars think is a good candidate. The first reason is that it does work with the chronology. This would have been very early in Paul's life as a believer, shortly after his conversion. So there's no chronological obstacles to it. But the real reason why scholars feel sort of compelled to consider this is because what Paul describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 has really some interesting parallels to Jewish literature, Jewish theology literature about visionary experiences, and also literature that was well before his era. So what Paul is describing here has parallels in contemporary literature to his own lifetime, and also literature that would have been a few hundred years earlier. Stuff we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So scholars have noticed, and I want to take you through some of these elements so that you can sort of understand why scholars think about these references and the passages the way they do. As far as the background, there's some sort of genre or subgenre of literature that are a lot like this. I'll mention two specifically. One is called, you might run into this if you're doing Bible study and you're doing background study, and I can't say the Hebrew word, hekhalot. It's a plural for palaces or temples. And so hekhalot literature describes sort of a cosmic journey through different levels of heavenly palaces or heavenly temples. That's one type. The other type is known as Merkava, mysticism, or Merkava could either be spelled, well, I won't get into that. It's pronounced, if you say it in Hebrew, Merkava, mysticism, the word literally means throne or chariot, or throne chariot. A Merkava is a throne chariot. It's the thing in Ezekiel 1. It's this throne upon which God seated in Ezekiel 1 that the certain cherubim underneath it, and the cherubim have wings and it moves around, that sort of thing. There's this whole literature, especially in Testaments, even more so with the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're familiar with that, and so on. Now, there's also some other stuff that goes on, and I won't get into too much of this because it gets really technical. But the reality is Paul, there's a connection with Paul's vision and what he's doing in heaven, and it references similar visions or similar type of visions that you see in Old Testament, especially with Ezekiel. Paul wants to refrain from boasting even if he drifts into account of seeing the very presence of God and, in fact, seeing the Lord. He is seeing the anthropomorphized God. He is seeing God in the flesh, Jesus, the resurrected Christ. So we get a very similar feel that at some point what Paul's saying. It's a divine encounter is what he's relating. Second point, parties, the four men, of course, and the only one that comes out of this sane and peaceful relates to the fact that if you survive this encounter, you'll have supernatural powers and authority and supernatural abilities, and so on and so forth. And so Paul's journey, Paul's message, Paul's whole thing there is quite crazy. And so you would have to get into a little bit more detail, and it would probably take more time than what I have today. But Paul's conversion was, let's just say, we're not sure if it was a trance or what it was, but there's a lot of things that you can look at. The other part of Paul's conversion, and if you look at Paul's missionary journeys from there, if you look at a map of Paul's missionary journey, and then you look at a map that had to do with the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, you will see that after the Tower of Babel, God divorced himself from nations and just kept certain allotment for himself. Well, when Paul goes on his missionary journeys, that map nearly matches the dispersion of the Tower of Babel. And when Paul is going about his journeys, he wants to get all the way to Spain, and he references that later on in the Bible. Spain is also the ancient city. Spain is also the area that is mentioned in Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah chapter 66, where God promised them that God will reclaim the nations. And so Paul's journey is a fulfillment of a prophecy, and Paul actually sees himself as a fulfillment of that prophecy back in Isaiah chapter 66. I'm going through a lot of stuff here pretty fast, and I hope this makes sense. But if you need some more information, I have it. But to kind of conclude, as we wrap up here, is that Paul's conversion was not just some fantasy or just some interesting story. Paul's conversion had a lot of God's purpose in it, for obvious reasons, not to just tell this amazing story of this backsliding Christian or this evil person going after Christians, but also someone who was changed by God in such a dramatic way, not only in such a dramatic way, but in a way that God used him to help promote the gospel, not only to the Gentiles, but also to Jews, but also to wrap up, to reclaim some of the nations that were lost back after the Tower of Babel. And so God's grace and God's forgiveness happened here even without even Paul asking for forgiveness. God made himself known to Paul even while he was sinning. And we see that in other verses where even in our sin, even before we confess, God is working on our behalf. All right, Jesus died on the cross while we were sinning, not after we got our lives cleaned together or cleaned up. So God is showing his grace to us through Paul. The mystery and the whole thing about Paul's conversion just alludes to the fact that God has a plan even for the deepest, darkest sinner that we can think of. It's God's grace, it's God's mercy, even before we confess. And we should thank God for that and be thankful that God has a plan for each one of us. And it was obvious with Paul and how much of an impact he made on the Bible. Okay, I shoved a lot of information in just a short amount of time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk with you guys later. I hope this was a blessing to you guys, and I thank you for listening.